The most powerful empire on earth tried to kill this religion. They burned its people alive, fed them to lions, crucified them by the thousands, and it didn't work. 300 years after a Roman governor executed a Jewish carpenter in an occupied province nobody cared about, Christianity became official religion of Rome itself. How does that happen? How does a movement that started with 12 terrified people hiding behind a locked door end up conquering the most powerful empire in human history? Not with an army, not with money, not with political power, with a message and the willingness to die for it. Every city, every turning point, every piece of archaeological evidence that proves it actually happened, mapped for the first time. Jerusalem, year 0. 30 AD. Find the eastern edge of the Roman Empire on this map. That tiny province, so small, Rome barely paid attention to it, is where it begins. Jerusalem, 30 AD. A man named Jesus of Nazareth has just been publicly executed by crucifixion outside the city walls. Crucifixion wasn't just an execution method, it was a message. Rome reserved it for slaves, criminals, and enemies of the state. It said, "This person is nobody. This movement is finished. Move on." And for 3 days, it worked. His followers scattered. His closest friend denied knowing him 3 times in a single night. Pontius Pilate sealed the tomb with a Roman guard. It was over, except it wasn't. 3 days later, his followers were back in the streets of Jerusalem. Not hiding, not whispering, shouting, claiming he had risen from the dead. The Roman historian Tacitus, who hated Christians and called their religion a destructive superstition, confirmed the execution of Jesus under Pontius Pilate in his Annals, written around 116 AD. He wasn't helping the Christian cause. He was explaining why this annoying movement existed. But he confirmed it. The execution happened. And the movement didn't die with the man. It exploded. The Jewish feast of Pentecost had brought pilgrims to Jerusalem from across the entire empire. Alexandria, Rome, Antioch, Ephesus, Mesopotamia. Weeks after the crucifixion, the disciples stood up in public and told everyone what they had seen. 3,000 people responded in a single day, in public, in Jerusalem, within walking distance of the tomb. If the body was still there, anyone could have checked. Nobody did. And those 3,000 pilgrims went home, carrying the story with them. The first missionary movement in history wasn't organized. It wasn't funded. It was just people going home from a festival. The first community. 30 to 37 AD. The earliest Christians in Jerusalem were entirely Jewish, still going to the temple, still keeping Jewish customs. They just added one conviction, that Jesus had risen, that he was the Messiah, and that everything had changed. Their leader was James, the brother of Jesus himself. If your brother claimed to be the Son of God, what would you think? James didn't believe Jesus during his ministry. The Gospel of John says so directly. But something changed his mind, something dramatic enough to make this skeptical brother the leader of the entire movement, and eventually die for it. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing for a Roman audience with zero interest in promoting Christianity, records that James, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, was stoned to death around 62 AD on the orders of the high priest. He confirmed James, he confirmed Jesus, and he confirmed that this community was significant enough to be worth killing. The Jerusalem church lasted 40 years, but before its end, another city was already becoming the new center of everything. Antioch, where the name started. 37 to 45 AD, move northwest on the map, up through Syria to a city on the Orontes River. Antioch, modern-day Antakya in southern Turkey. 500,000 people. The third largest city in the Roman Empire. And it is here, not in Jerusalem, not in Rome, that the followers of Jesus got the name that would define them for 2,000 years. Christianoi, Christians. Not a name they chose, a nickname, probably mocking, given by the people of Antioch. It stuck. Just outside modern Antiquity, carved into the face of a mountain, is the cave church of St. Peter, one of the oldest Christian worship sites in the world, still standing, still visited today. But here is why Antioch matters most. It was from here that the most aggressive missionary in history launched his campaign. A man who had spent the previous years trying to destroy the church. Damascus, the conversion that changed everything. 37 AD. Saul of Tarsus was not a fisherman, highly educated Pharisee, trained under the great Rabbi Gamaliel, Roman citizen, rare and powerful. He watched approvingly as Stephen became the first Christian martyr, went house to house in Jerusalem, dragging men and women to prison, and was heading to Damascus with official papers to do the same thing there. He never made it. Something happened on that road, a light so bright it knocked him to the ground. A voice, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" Whatever it was, it left him blind for 3 days and completely reversed the trajectory of the most motivated enemy the early church had. Paul himself wrote it in his letter to the Galatians, that he had violently persecuted the church and that God revealed his Son to him. Now here is what made Paul so dangerous to Rome. He was absolutely convinced the message of Jesus was not just for Jews. Every nation, every language, every slave, soldier, and senator in the empire. And he spent the rest of his life crossing that empire to prove it. Cyprus, the first island. 47 AD. Paul's first journey began with a boat. From Antioch, he and Barnabas sailed to Cyprus. They crossed the island to Paphos, the Roman capital, where the governor himself, Sergius Paulus, summoned Paul to hear his message. You might think, interesting story, probably invented, except archaeologists found an inscription on Cyprus bearing the name Sergius Paulus, his exact title, dated to the precise year Paul would have been there. A Roman governor, already interested in this message, 15 years after the crucifixion. Christianity was reaching the top of Roman society before most people had even heard of it. Galatia, stoned and still going, 47 to 48 AD. From Cyprus, Paul pushed inland into Galatia, modern Turkey. In Lystra, the crowd stoned him, dragged him outside the city, and left him for dead. He got up, went back in, continued the journey, run out of Antioch in Pisidia, chased from Iconium, and yet in every single city, he left behind a functioning community of believers. This man was beaten, stoned, imprisoned, and expelled repeatedly. And he kept going, not because it was safe, because he was certain it was true. You don't take that kind of punishment for something you're not sure about. The decision that opened the floodgates. 49 AD. Before Paul entered Europe, one meeting changed everything. The question was brutally simple. If a non-Jew wanted to follow Jesus, did they have to become Jewish first? Circumcision, dietary laws, the entire law of Moses. If yes, Christianity stays a Jewish sect, limited to one people. If no, the entire Roman Empire is in play. In 49 AD, Peter, Paul, and James gathered in Jerusalem to settle it. The verdict, no, faith in Christ was sufficient, period. That decision is the reason you and I are talking about this today. Philippi, the first church in Europe. 49 AD. Paul had a vision, a man from Macedonia begging him to come over and help. He sailed across the Aegean, walked the Via Egnatia to Philippi, a Roman military colony. Rome fanatics. His first convert was not a soldier or a philosopher. It was a businesswoman named Lydia, a merchant of purple cloth, selling exclusively to royalty and the very wealthy. Successful, independent, the founding member of the first church on European soil. The ruins of ancient Philippi are still visible in northern Greece today, including the river where tradition says Lydia was baptized. Paul was beaten and imprisoned there. The church kept growing. Europe had been reached. Thessalonica, turning the world upside down. 49 AD. From Philippi, Paul walked west to Thessalonica, modern Thessaloniki. 3 weeks of preaching, enough to terrify the local authorities. The accusation they brought against his associates tells you everything. These men have turned the world upside down. And they are saying there is another king, Jesus, not Caesar. In a city centered on emperor worship. This was not a religious complaint. It was a declaration of political war. Paul was expelled. The church stayed, turning the world upside down. They had no idea how right they were. Athens, one man against the philosophers. 50 AD. Paul arrived in Athens alone, the city of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and hundreds of stone idols in every direction. The philosophers called him a seed picker, someone collecting scraps of other people's ideas. They brought him to the Areopagus, Mars Hill, the same stone outcropping where Socrates had once been tried for introducing new gods. And Paul did something brilliant. He didn't quote Jewish scripture. He quoted their own poets. He pointed to their own altar, dedicated to the unknown God, and introduced them to the God who was no longer unknown. Some mocked, but Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus Council itself, believed. Tradition records him as the first bishop of Athens. Today, Athens is a majority Christian city, tracing its roots to one man on a marble hill. Corinth, the most unlikely church in history. 50 to 52 AD. From Athens, Paul moved to Corinth. If Athens was the intellectual capital of Greece, Corinth was its moral opposite. One of the most strategically located ports in the ancient world. Wealthy, notorious. The word Corinthian was a synonym for sexual immorality across the entire Mediterranean. Not exactly fertile ground for a church. And yet Paul spent 18 months there, longer than almost anywhere else. Archaeologist Oscar Broneer excavated Corinth through the mid-20th century, uncovering the Bema, the judgment seat where Paul was dragged before the Roman proconsul, Gallio. At Delphi, archaeologists found the Gallio inscription, naming Gallio as proconsul and dating his tenure to exactly 51 to 52 AD. The stone doesn't lie. Paul was there. The church at Corinth was messy, divided, and deeply flawed. But 2,000 years later, the words Paul wrote to this church of former idol worshippers in a Roman port city are still read at wedding ceremonies around the world. Ephesus, the city that tried to kill him. 52 to 55 AD. And now we reach the city Paul had been trying to reach for years. Ephesus, capital of Roman Asia, third largest city in the empire, 200,000 people. And at its center, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Temple of Artemis, 4 times the size of the Parthenon, 127 columns, 60 feet tall. Austrian archaeologist Johann Georg Benndorf began excavating Ephesus in 1895. Over a century of work has uncovered one of the best preserved ancient cities in the world. You can walk those marble streets today. Paul spent 3 years here. Taught daily, his disciples spread out across the entire province, planting what would become the 7 churches of Asia Minor. But success bred opposition. A silversmith named Demetrius watched his shrine-making business collapse as people turned from Artemis to Christ. He incited a riot. 25,000 people flooded into the Great Theater, chanting for 2 solid hours, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." That theater is still standing today. Paul escaped, but the church remained and became one of the most significant in the ancient world. Rome. They were already there. 57 to 68 AD. Now we move to Rome itself. 1 million people, the capital of everything. And here is what most people don't realize. Christianity was already there before Paul arrived. Paul's letter to the Romans, written around 57 AD, addresses a church he didn't plant and had never visited. The Roman historian Suetonius accidentally confirms it, recording that Emperor Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome around 49 AD due to disturbances over one Chrestus. Most historians read that as Christ, which means Christianity had reached Rome, caused enough controversy to expel an entire ethnic group within 20 years of the crucifixion. Paul arrived as a prisoner around 60 AD, having appealed his case to Caesar. He spent 2 years under house arrest, freely preaching. Peter was already there too, and both of them would die there. Under Nero. Nero and the Night. Everything changed. 64 AD. A catastrophic fire destroys large portions of Rome. Nero needs someone to blame. He chooses the Christians. Tacitus, who hated them, describes what followed with cold precision. Christians covered in animal skins and torn apart by dogs, nailed to crosses, set on fire to light Nero's gardens at night. Even Tacitus noted that Nero's cruelty aroused pity. The victims were being destroyed not for the public good, but to satisfy one man's sadism. Peter was crucified, tradition says upside down, at his own request. Paul was beheaded, both deaths confirmed by Clement of Rome, writing around 96 AD in one of the oldest non-biblical Christian documents in existence. You would think executing the 2 most prominent leaders of a movement would destroy it. Rome had no idea what it had just started. The catacombs, what they painted on their tomb walls. 64 to 313 AD. Beneath the streets of Rome, stretching over 40 miles, lie the Roman catacombs, the burial places of an estimated 500,000 Christians. Archaeologist Giovanni Battista de Rossi spent decades mapping them from 1849 onward. What he found painted on those tomb walls, in a city where Christians were being used as human torches, were images of resurrection: the Good Shepherd, Jonah from the fish, Daniel in the lion's den, Lazarus walking out of his tomb. Every image saying the same thing: death is not the end. That is not the behavior of people who aren't sure. That is the behavior of people who are absolutely certain. Alexandria, where Christianity learned to think. Late 1st century, AD. Move the map southwest to Egypt. Alexandria, 2nd largest city in the empire, home to the greatest library in the ancient world. Tradition holds that the Apostle Mark brought Christianity here around 49 AD, founding what became the Coptic Church, one of the oldest continuous Christian communities on earth. Tens of millions of members, still worshiping today. But Alexandria wasn't just where Christianity arrived, it was where Christianity learned to think. The Catechetical School of Alexandria, founded around 190 AD, became the first formal Christian theological institution in history. Clement argued that Greek philosophy had been pointing toward Christ without knowing it. His successor, Origen, produced an estimated 2,000 works before his death, around 254 AD. And Alexandria produced the man who would define what Christians believed about Jesus, himself. His name was Athanasius, but we are not there yet. Carthage, the man who invented the word Trinity. Late 2nd century AD. Move west along the North African coast to Carthage, modern Tunisia. By the late 2nd century, North Africa had become one of the most explosive centers of Christianity in the entire empire. The man who defined it was Tertullian. Born around 155 AD, trained as a Roman lawyer, converted in his 30s. The first major Christian writer to compose in Latin rather than Greek. Until Tertullian, Christian theology was an Eastern, Greek-speaking enterprise. Tertullian took it west, into the language of Roman law. He coined the word Trinity. He asked the question that defined 2 centuries of debate. What has Athens to do with Jerusalem? Theologians are still arguing about it. North Africa would go on to produce Cyprian of Carthage, bishop killed for his faith in 258 AD, and a boy born in 354 AD in modern Algeria whose name was Augustine, the man who would explain why Rome's fall didn't matter. But we are getting there. The 7 churches still in the ground. Late 1st century AD. Return to Asia Minor. The Book of Revelation was written by the Apostle John around 95 AD, while exiled on the island of Patmos off the Turkish coast by Emperor Domitian for refusing to stop preaching. It was addressed to 7 specific churches: Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamon, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea. Real cities, real congregations, real problems. And all 7 have been excavated. At Pergamon, you can still see the ruins of the great altar of Zeus, the very structure John calls the throne of Satan in Revelation. At Laodicea, excavations in 2019 uncovered a church building dated to the 1st century AD. One of the oldest purpose-built Christian structures ever found. At Smyrna, modern Izmir, the 2nd century bishop was Polycarp, a man who had personally known the Apostle John. He was arrested and brought into the stadium, told to renounce Christ or die. He was 86 years old. 86 years I have served him, he said, and he has done me no wrong. How can I blaspheme my king who saved me? They burned him alive. Eyewitnesses recorded it. By 155 AD, an elderly man could say he had served Christ for 86 years. He had known John. John had known Jesus. The chain from the crucifixion to that stadium was 2 people long. 2. The East, nobody talks about. Late 1st and 2nd century AD. Most people think of Christianity spreading west, but the map tells a different story. The city of Edessa, modern Urfa, in southeastern Turkey, became one of the earliest Christian kingdoms in history, with a Christian king by the late 2nd century. Further east through Mesopotamia and Persia, Syriac-speaking Christian communities spread along trade routes that had nothing to do with Rome. And the Thomas Christians of Kerala in southern India trace their origin to the Apostle Thomas himself, around 52 AD. Whether Thomas personally made that journey cannot be verified, but the community exists, ancient, unbroken, with its own distinct Syriac liturgical tradition going back nearly 2,000 years. Christianity was never just a Western religion. From the very beginning, it moved in every direction, along every road, every trade route, every relationship. The persecutions, what it actually cost. 64 to 313 AD, before we get to Constantine. We need to look at what this faith actually cost, because it is easy to talk about the spread of Christianity as a historical trend. It is harder to look at the individual faces. Perpetua of Carthage was 22 years old, a noblewoman, nursing a newborn baby. Arrested in 203 AD. She kept a prison diary, one of the earliest writings by a Christian woman in history, recording her visions, her conversations with her jailers, and her grief at being separated from her infant son. Her father begged her to recant. "Save yourself, save your baby." She refused. On the day of her execution in the arena, she walked in singing. A wild heifer threw her to the ground. She got up, fixed her hair, and waited for the end. The eyewitness account records that she guided the soldier's sword to her own throat. She was 22 years old. Ignatius of Antioch, bishop of the city where they were first called Christians, was being transported to Rome for execution around 107 AD. He wrote letters to the churches along the way, begging them not to intervene. "I am God's wheat," he wrote, "to be ground by the teeth of wild beasts, so that I may prove to be pure bread, not afraid, eager." In 250 AD, Emperor Decius issued the first empire-wide order, requiring every citizen to sacrifice to the Roman gods. Officials handed out certificates, libelli, to those who complied. Archaeologists have found those certificates in Egypt, physical documents, still readable. Christians who refused faced death. Many recanted, many didn't. Then came the worst. Diocletian's great persecution in 303. AD, churches demolished, scriptures burned, Christians stripped of all legal rights, mass executions across the empire. It lasted 10 years, and then it stopped. Not because Rome won, because Rome couldn't win. Tertullian had written it a century earlier. The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. Every public death produced the same question in the crowd. Why are they dying for this? What do they know that we don't? And people went to find out. Constantine, credit where it's due and where it isn't. 312 to 337 AD. In 312 AD, a Roman general named Constantine was marching on Rome to fight his rival Maxentius for control of the empire. The night before the Battle of Milvian Bridge, he reported a vision, a cross of light in the sky. In this sign, conquer. He painted the Chi on his soldiers' shields, the first two Greek letters of Christ. He won the battle, and the Roman Empire was never the same. Now, let's be precise, because Constantine gets both too much credit and too much blame. What he actually did, in 313 AD, the Edict of Milan granted full religious toleration across the empire. After 250 years of persecution, Christianity was legal. He funded church construction, exempted clergy from taxation, promoted Christians to high office. And in 325 AD, he convened the Council of Nicaea. 300 bishops from across the empire gathered to settle the most explosive theological dispute in Christian history. What he did not do, he did not create Christianity. He did not even make it the official state religion. That was Theodosius in 380 AD, 40 years later. Was he a genuine believer? He wasn't baptized until his deathbed. He continued pagan imagery on coins. He executed his own son and wife within years of Nicaea. Complicated man, complicated time. But one thing is not complicated. Christianity had been growing for 280 years before Constantine was born. It had survived Nero, survived Decius, survived Diocletian. Constantine opened the door, but Christianity had been knocking for 3 centuries. The Council of Nicaea, the meeting that defined the faith. 325 AD. What happened at Nicaea wasn't just politics. It was theology that would define what billions of people believed for 17 centuries. A priest from Alexandria named Orius had been teaching that Jesus was a created being, the greatest of God's creations, but not eternal, not fully God. There was a time, Arius said, when the sun was not. His opponent was a young deacon from Alexandria named Athanasius. His argument was precise. If Jesus was not fully God, then his death was just a man dying. Nothing the gospel promised had actually happened. The council sided with Athanasius. The Nicene Creed declared Jesus to be of the same substance as the Father. One Greek word, homoousios, the most argued over term in the history of theology. The debate raged for another 50 years. Athanasius was exiled 5 times for his position. 5 times. And 5 times he came back. Athanasius against the world. He summarized the entire argument in one sentence. God became man so that man might become God. Constantinople. The empire moves 330 AD. In 330 AD, Constantine moved the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome, ancient, western, pagan in its bones, to a new city built from scratch on the peninsula where Europe meets Asia. Constantinople, modern Istanbul, built as an explicitly Christian city, no founding pagan temples, churches at its center. This was a declaration. The new empire would be a Christian empire. Constantinople became the heart of the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, which would last another 1,000 years after Rome fell. The Hagia Sophia, built by Justinian in 537 AD, became the greatest Christian building in the world. You can visit it today, and standing under that floating dome, you understand why people in the 6th century thought they were standing at the edge of heaven. The fall of Rome, and why the church didn't fall with it. 410 to 476 AD. In 410 AD, Rome was sacked by the Visigoths under Alaric. For the first time in 800 years, Rome had fallen to a foreign enemy. The pagan Romans had an explanation. The gods abandoned Rome because Rome abandoned the gods. Christianity killed the empire. And into that moment, with the ancient world collapsing, a bishop in the North African city of Hippo sat down to write a response. His name was Augustine. Born 354 AD in modern Algeria. Raised by a praying mother named Monica. Eventually converted, eventually became a bishop, eventually became the most influential theologian in Western Christianity after Paul himself. His response was the city of God, 13 years to write. His argument, Rome didn't fall because of Christianity. Rome was always built on power and violence and pride. Its fall was always coming. But the city of God, the community united by love of God rather than love of power, was not Roman, not tied to any earthly empire. It would outlast Rome. It would outlast every empire. He was writing in 413 AD. The Western Roman Empire had 23 years left. In 476 AD, the last Western Roman emperor, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by a Germanic chieftain. The Western Roman Empire was gone. But the bishops remained, the churches remained, the monasteries remained. Christian bishops stepped into the vacuum left by collapsing Roman administration. They became judges, welfare administrators, the last functioning civic institutions in cities the empire had abandoned. Christianity didn't just survive the fall of Rome. It became the vessel through which Roman civilization was passed to the medieval world. The empire that had burned Christians alive in Nero's gardens had its civilization preserved by the people it tried to destroy. The historian Will Durant, not a Christian, assessed the entire 300 years in one sentence. Caesar and Christ had met in the arena, he wrote, and Christ had won. Caesar had every advantage: the army, the law, the power of life and death over every person in the empire. Christ had one thing, the truth, and it was enough.